Hey everybody, welcome back to the program. Today, I'm recording this remotely, so the audio might be a little bit different, and there's no camera. I'm using strictly the laptop microphone here, but I got a really good article today that was very interesting, really controversial. Again, I just want to put a disclaimer out there for a lot of people who are about to hear this. Whenever I do subjects on biblical archaeology, meaning any archaeological dig that has to do with corroborating dates in the Bible and other scriptures, I don't believe or disbelieve anything. I'm just strictly reporting what was discovered and what's out in the academic journals now, and what's being conducted by archaeologists all over the world. And I do believe this is a significant find, and if it is indeed true, which is very, very compelling that it might be. Either way, let's try to keep it clean in the comments. I think this is a very interesting idea to just discuss. So without further ado, let's talk about the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem, which was found in the Mount Zion excavation conducted by a team from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. So if you guys don't know, at the time of about 587 to 586 BC, Babylon, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, headed by this guy, Nebuchadnezzar II, they took over Jerusalem and essentially set it on fire and destroyed the Temple of Solomon, which was the first time that the Jewish temple was destroyed. So this was written about in biblical texts, obviously, and it was always talked about in academia, but there was no real hard evidence of this occurring. Although there were peripheral archaeological finds such as Scythian arrowheads and daggers and jewelry and stuff like that. But this is the closest that they've ever gotten to proving that Babylon did indeed take over the city from 587 to 586 BC and indeed burnt most of it to the ground. So you guys be the judge after hearing about it. So researchers digging at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte's archaeological excavation on Mount Zion in Jerusalem have announced a second significant discovery from the 2019 season. So clear evidence of the Babylonian conquest of the city. What they found were layers of ash, arrowheads dating from the period, Iron Age potsherds, which again go back almost 1000 BC, as early as 1000 BC, 1300 BC. A significant piece of lamps, significant piece of period jewelry, gold and silver tassels, earrings, etc., etc. They found an Iron Age structure in the area underneath the layers of ash, but they haven't excavated that, so I'm tuning in to see what they pull up later. But again, the reason why that hasn't been excavated is because they have to do everything in order. They can't just go straight down there. They've got to take everything out as it appears in the archaeological record. Just to give you guys a look here, just a visual. Where is it? It's also known as the captivity of Judah, 586 to 516 BC. So as you can see, this is Babylon, and this along the Euphrates River and down towards Syria, Damascus, and Haiti, the Hatti rather, and all the way down to Jerusalem is the Neo-Babylonian Empire, more or less, during this time. With that out of the way, the current find is one of the oldest and perhaps the most prominent in its historical significance, as the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem is a major moment in Jewish history. The team believes that the newly found deposit can be dated to the specific event of the conquest because of the unique mix of artifacts and materials found, pottery and lamps side by side with evidence of the Babylonian siege, represented by burnt wood and ashes, and a number of Scythian-type bronze and iron arrowheads, which are typical of that period. So they find a lot of Scythian type of bronze and iron weapons, and that's very interesting because I did an episode of the Scythian migration and how they may have been the seed for basically all of the genetics of most of the people that make up Western civilization now. And you can see from this graphic here, around 700 to 600 BC, this was a major migration of the Scythians out from the Caucasus Mountains and north of the Black Sea. They went in all directions. This map isn't really it shows mainly the southeastern and the southwestern and the more western migration route, but they also spread east as well into China. So just to give you guys a little bit of historical context, around this time the Scythians were at war basically with the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, and the Assyrians, who the Scythians played a vital role in destroying the Assyrian Empire around here, where south of Lydia or modern day Turkey, all the way down to Palestine and right near Egypt. So the Scythians were, if you can imagine, like these marauders on horseback coming down through the empire in all directions, and they without a doubt had a huge impact culturally and technologically on the wars to come and how warfare was conducted in this area in the centuries to come. So this is about 200 years, 150, 200 years before the fall of Jerusalem. So with that in mind, it puts this historical, this archaeological find in context, so to speak. So they find all these Scythian bronze and iron arrowheads for years in the archaeological record. And because of the site's location, and by the way, this is the site here. So if you look at Temple Mount, the city of David in the southeast, and then, quote, Mount Zion, which is where this excavation basically covers this entire lower part of the old, or south of the old city. So this Hezekiah's extension is what's now called the Old City. This is Temple Mount, where the Temple of Solomon was. The Mount of Olives to the east, but mostly it's Mount Zion and the city of David. This is where the excavation has taken place. And within this excavation, they found layers of ash, jewelry, and all that stuff, which we'll get into now. So Gibson, he's one of the head excavators. He says, we know where the ancient fortification line ran, so we know we are within the city. We know that this is not some dumping area, but the southwestern neighborhood of the Iron Age city. Again, the southwestern neighborhood, right around here, near what's called Mount Zion. During the 8th century BC, the urban area extended from the city of David to the southeast and as far as the western hill where we are digging. So the ash deposits are not conclusive evidence of the Babylonian attack in themselves, but are much more so in the context of other materials. So this is a main sticking point in the research here, is just because there's ash, just because there's weapons, just because there's jewelry and all this stuff, all these things indicative of a highly successful city with a nobility class and a bustling city that you would expect a lot of jewelry and a lot of these expensive artifacts that are indicative of a successful city. Again, they're among the ash, but that doesn't necessarily mean that was the Babylonian conquest. It's almost everything but that. So that's a big sticking point here that a lot of critics will have. But nevertheless, this is a very interesting discovery. For archaeologists, an ashen layer can mean a number of different things. It could be ashy deposits removed from ovens, or it could be localized burning of garbage, which really was a lot of the case back then. They didn't know what to do with garbage, so they just burnt it. But in this case, this specific case, when you talk about the biblical accounts and what's specifically written in the text and has been corroborated in by other historians and other scripture as well, the combination of an ashy layer full of artifacts mixed with arrowheads, this new, or at the time, this new technology from the Scythians of the steppe, and very special ornaments indicate some kind of devastation and destruction. Nobody abandons gold and jewelry. Nobody has arrowheads in their domestic refuse. So again, you find all these peculiar items that you can kind of eliminate the fact that they were just burning garbage and that's where the ash came from, or they were just removing stuff from ovens, like deposits from ovens. This was basically city-wide ash all over. So what that means to you is, again, it's up to you, but to these archaeologists, to them, they think that, well, this city was sacked. There's no way around it. I mean, where else would all this ash come from? The arrowheads are known as Scythian arrowheads and have been found at other archaeological conflict sites from the 7th and 8th centuries BC. And again, that makes sense because that's around the time that the Scythians were migrating in the area and just spreading their culture, raising cities, kind of like the Mongols, but not to that extent, obviously. But they were using very similar tactics. They are known at sites around outside of Israel as well. They were fairly commonplace in this period and are known to be used by the Babylonian warriors. So the Babylonians, they took a cue from the Scythians, and it's unclear what the Babylonians and the Scythians, what their relationship was, but it's been speculated that the two groups worked in tandem to take over what's now called the City of David, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the Assyrian Empire, and the later Achaemenid Empire as well. So together this evidence points to the historical conquest of the city by Babylon, because the only major destruction we have in Jerusalem for this period is the conquest of 587 to 586 BC. So basically what he's saying is, you can't, if this indeed happened, a city burnt to the ground in this area near Mount Zion, then it had to have been the conquest of Babylon, because there were no other documented cases of the Babylonians taking over cities at this time period. So some people might think that's an assumption. Other people might think that is right on the money. Again, it's up to you. This is why it's very controversial, because again, anytime you're dealing with biblical archaeology, there's going to be all kinds of opinions. There's going to be a lot of different theories that are at the expense of these types of archaeological discoveries. They'll just fall by the wayside. And there are people, just like with Egyptology, there are people in positions of power in academia that depend on certain data sets being unaltered. So stuff like this kind of throws a monkey wrench in the established paradigm. The clay artifacts also help date the discovery. The lamps are the typical high-base pinched lamps of the period. So again, the artifacts that are there are consistent with what was already existing. These high-based pinched lamps, again, they're indicative of that time period of Jerusalem, of what they were using at the time. And he says, it's the kind of jumble that you would expect to find in a ruined household following a raid or battle. And that does make sense. If you're living in a nice house and you have all these extravagant, not even extravagant, just these items that are indicative of the class you are, during a raid or anything, all that stuff is going to fall on the ground, stuff's going to get looted, stuff's going to get shattered, and it'll litter the ground almost like a battlefield. So the way that they found them, these broken bits, these household objects, and the arrowheads that are littering the ground along with the ash, again, are indicative of a very, very violent takeover and raid that lasted about a year. And the reason why it lasted a year, well, we'll get into that later, but the king of Jerusalem at the time was very, he wouldn't budge. He was very, very stubborn about not conceding. And eventually the Babylonians, he eventually submitted, and then as the story goes, he was taken back to Babylon as a captive, which is called, I think, something of Judah, the captive of Judah, or the captive, I don't know, I forget what it's called, but something of Judah. My mind's not working correctly right now. Jewelry is a rare find at a conflict site, because this is exactly the sort of thing that attackers will loot and later melt down. So that is a curious thing as well. Why is there jewelry still there to be looted? Wouldn't they have taken it? That's a great question that isn't really addressed. So again, that's something that maybe will be, with further excavation, that there'll be some sort of answer to that. So this is Gibson. He starts speculating here. I like to think that we are excavating inside one of the great man's houses, mentioned in the second book of Kings 25:9. This spot would have been at an ideal location, situated as it is close to the western summit of the city, with a good view overlooking Solomon's Temple and Mount Moriah to the northeast. So if we look at the map here, where did I put it? Yeah, so it would be in these hills near Mount Zion, again, that would have a great view of the entire area. And it is true that Solomon's Temple was burnt down twice. It was burnt down and rebuilt twice. First by the Babylonians, and then again by the Romans later, like 600 years later or something like that. Another peculiar thing about that I should mention is that when the Torah and later on the Talmud were written, they were written around this time. Around 500 BC or 600 BC, around there. And before that, it was totally an oral history. So the oral history allegedly goes back to around 1300 BC. Now, if you have a kingdom like Jerusalem, where their oral, whatever it is, their oral history, their oral scripture, I guess that's kind of an oxymoron. Their oral tradition is completely not written down, and it's just passed from one generation to the next. When you have a force like Babylon coming in and destroying everything, one way to preserve that would be to write everything down. So that answers the question as to why the Torah was written down at the time it was written down. It just happened to be the time when Jerusalem, the kingdom, was razed to the ground. So that alone is very compelling, that fact that you have Jerusalem burnt down, and then their culture only survives through the written word amongst it was a group of rabbis that wrote it down. I forget their name. I don't think it's the Sanhedrin. It might be the Sanhedrin. But either way, this offshoot group of elders, or whatever you want to call them, they got together. They shared what they knew of the oral history and wrote as much as down as possible. And again, that later became the Old Testament. So Gibson goes on. He says, the reason that we are slowly taking the site down, level by level, period by period, and at the end of this last digging season, 2 meters of domestic structures from later Byzantine and Roman periods have still to be dug above the Iron Age level below. So next year they're going to get down there, 2020. But before they get down there, they've got to do a really good job, because it's hard to get an archaeological dig going, especially in a place like Israel, and especially at a holy site like Mount Zion. So they're going to take their time and really do a thorough job. That's what I'm gathering anyway. I'm not in the ear of any of these archaeologists, but this is just what I'm gathering from their quotes here. So they found some silver trinkets or jewelry in the shape of a cluster of grapes. He noted that this discovery is a unique find and is a clear indication of the wealth of the inhabitants of the city at the time of the siege. Because again, this wasn't a poor nation. This was a very, very at the height of its. You can almost say that it was almost on the downturn, just because of the golden age of Jerusalem was the time of Solomon, and before that King David, and then from there, they're just so used to this type of success, this fortune, this city, the kingdom was so successful. It was such a successful kingdom that of course it's going to decline, just like any other empire or any other kingdom declines after a few generations. So it's very interesting that the wealth of the city is still around among the ash, that you would think that a group, even the Scythians, like that, they would have taken everything, just with how thorough they are in what they do. Right, so this is when Jerusalem was separated. So there was Judah and then Jerusalem. Jerusalem was on the northern part, and Judah was on the southern part. and King Zedekiah, who he tried to flee the city with his retinue, and then he was caught, taken captive, and this was all after he was holding out for so long while the city was essentially burning for months and months, and he still refused. He tried to leave, and then he was caught trying to abandon his people. Within the Hebrew Bible, it relates that the famine and suffering that the inhabitants of Jerusalem suffered during the lengthy Babylonian siege of the city. Quote, so the city was besieged unto the 11th year of King Zedekiah. On the 9th day of the 4th month of the famine was sore in the city, so that there was no bread for the people of the land. Then a breach was made in the city, and all the men of war fled by night by the way of the gate between the two walls. And he, the Babylonian captain of the guard, burnt the house of the Lord and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem, even every great man's house, burnt he with fire. So this was in the Book of Kings, and this is what Gibson was talking about. He thinks one of these king's houses, or one of the great men's houses, was amongst what was excavated here. And these guys they just went down with everything that they had. A lot of them, they didn't budge, and then they were just consumed by the flames of war, according to the story. And according to Gibson, that's also what happened. He believes that this is a smoking gun that proves that the kingdom of Judah was sacked by the Neo-Babylonians, and they torched Solomon's temple, and that was that. So a lot of people will say that this is all of this archaeological excavations done in Israel it's supposedly some sort of greater plan for to build evidence for and an excuse to tear down what's that Temple Mount now, and to build Solomon's temple again, the third temple. And that's one of the main criticisms here. And you can call it conspiracy theory or not. I've read a lot about this. I've seen both sides of the argument, and I don't know, maybe there's some grand conspiracy to do this, but either way, there is an excavation going on there, and there really is a layer of ash. They really are finding all these things, and I think that's far-fetched. So I don't think they could use archaeological evidence to justify tearing down the mosque there and building Solomon's third temple. Now, you might think I'm naive or whatever. There are a lot of people who are quick to call people Zionists. But I think, again, let's just look at the excavation itself and see what these archaeologists have to say, and then we can talk about everything else later. Either way, I think the idea of biblical archaeology is very interesting. It's exciting that there were people writing stuff down 2,000 plus years ago, and it's being borne out in excavations now. And it just if you go back to one of my episodes where I compare David to some of the, like, Akhenaten to Moses, and Solomon to Amenhotep III, all of these different correlations between the kings of Jerusalem and these Egyptian kings, the Amarna kings, is very compelling. Again, and it's all jumbled up. It's very hard to understand what's going on and who was writing what and what their motives were at the time. But either way, this adds a lot to I guess you can call it the global repository of archaeological evidence that's come out, and we can just see and compare notes, and that's the main focus here. It's not trying to push an agenda or anything like that. And again, I don't believe in any of that stuff. I don't believe or disbelieve any of that stuff. I'm not trying to push anything. I'm just trying to let you guys know what is happening on the archaeological front. That's it. So anyway, you guys should probably take a look at some of the maps here. There's some good images in the article. I'll have linked in the description. And here's a better picture of I think this is around 540. So this is about 45 years after this happened, you have this part in Neo-Babylonian Empire here. It's still everything. Judah, Jerusalem is still part of this empire, and you can see the Scythians are backed into the Caucasus again, and then you have the Persian Empire starting to spread as well. It's part of Armenia and modern day Turkey and all this stuff. So yeah, just keep it clean in the comments, guys, and I'll probably have another episode tomorrow. And I might not. Hopefully I'll have everything set up again and the audio quality is better.